Hi, welcome to the second episode of Aging, Radiation, and Tennis. This is Charlie. Our standard disclosures, this is for informational purposes only and does not serve as medical advice. Our guest today is Professor Matt Kaeberlein from University of Washington and a friend and partner of Asia Longevity Center. So please enjoy our discussion on longevity. Great to be here with Professor Matt Kaeberlein, world-renowned geroscientist, longevity scientist. And how would you introduce yourself, Matt, after your recent changes? And would that have changed in, say, the last 2 or 3 months?
I don't know. I'm definitely still a scientist. I don't know if I do. I still get to be called a professor. I think so. I think once a professor, always a professor. So
Yeah.
I'm a scientist who's interested in the biology of aging, and particularly interested in trying to take some of what we've learned about the biology of aging in the laboratory and bring it into the real world, both in companion animals and in people.
Hmm. So last time we met, as I think most times we meet, we are eating food and dim sum last time.
Yeah.
So I was curious as to, when you and your family go out to eat, what do you guys eat, and has that changed with your interest in longevity?
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, we typically don't go out to eat that often. So I'd say that's one of the things that we have made a conscious effort at is kind of reducing the frequency at which we go out to eat versus having meals prepared at home. I think, for anybody who's interested in health, to the extent that you are able to do that, that's usually a good idea. Obviously, it depends on, what your home eating habits are as well. But one of the reasons for doing that is you oftentimes aren't able to control or don't necessarily know what the ingredients are that are going into what you're eating when you're eating out. So when we do go out to eat, or more often do takeout to have at home, I certainly within the last 5 or 10 years have made a conscious effort to shift away from what used to be, my weakness, which was super nachos. I love Mexican food. I love nachos. Still like to indulge once in a while, but maybe not as regularly as I used to.
Mhm.
So, typically we have a couple of good places in town that have really good steak salad or Asian chicken salads, which are pretty healthy and I enjoy quite a bit. So typically that's what I would order if we were to do takeout at home.
Hmm. And how often do you eat? I'm curious.
Yeah. It depends a bit on the day, but
Yeah.
I tend to eat pretty much throughout the day. So I'm not a big believer in intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding, at least in the context of uh, not reducing calories. So I think both intermittent fasting and time restricted feeding can be quite useful strategies for some people who are
Mhm.
trying to lose weight.
Right.
But I'm personally not convinced that they have much, if any, value if you're not intentionally trying to restrict calories in order to lose, or for some people, maintain body weight. Certainly not a one size fits all solution. So for me personally, I tend to eat throughout the day. Like I said, it depends a little bit on the day, depends on where I'm at.
Mhm.
Sometimes I'll skip lunch, but I'd say in a typical day, I probably eat 4 or 5 times a day, you know, two pretty good sized meals and then kind of little snacks here and there. Also depends on when I exercise. So I'm pretty avid exerciser. I work out most days of the week. And so, depending on when I work out and whether I'm doing resistance training or cardio, that affects my appetite. I tend to eat when I'm hungry.
Mhm.
I don't spend a lot of time, intentionally trying to restrict myself. Personally, I found for me that's not a particularly successful strategy
Mhm.
to feel like I'm deprived. And so I tend to eat when I'm hungry, but I very much have, again, in the last 5 or 10 years, made a conscious shift away from processed foods, simple sugars. I eat a relatively low carbohydrate diet, not keto at all,
Right.
but stay away from simple sugars, lots of fruits and vegetables, and lots of whole foods.
Uh-huh. So I think uh I I pretty much follow your thoughts. Have you experimented with some of these time restricted eating habits and stuff like that, keto? Have you tried any of
A little
these?
bit. Yeah. So not so much with fasting. Again, I think we have to really be cognizant of what the research actually shows. So it's very clear from the animal studies that intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding, in the absence of caloric restriction, have little to no effect on longevity or health.
Mhm.
That's been very much misinterpreted.
Yeah,
Uh, but that's what the data clearly shows. In humans, it's a little bit more complicated, but I think what we're finding, and again, time will tell, I think what we're finding is that intermittent fasting, even when it's used for weight loss, is associated with negative changes in body composition. And what I mean by that is a preferential loss of lean mass. So you're going to lose weight if you're restricting calories, but it seems as if it might be the case that if you lose weight through intermittent fasting, you actually tend to lose more lean mass than if you were to do sort of a gradual weight loss, without doing fasting or things like that. So I have not personally spent any time trying intermittent fasting or for that reason. I'm again very conscientious about trying to maintain muscle mass as I'm
right.
getting older. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do.
Mm.
And so I don't want to do anything that's gonna screw that up. Plus, I like to eat. I don't. I've already established that I don't like feeling hungry.
Yeah.
So I haven't really done much with fasting or really even time restricted feeding. Um, I have tried a ketogenic diet. I actually did ketogenic diet for probably at least a year.
Mm.
Again, I wasn't super strict about it, but it was certainly in most days I was in ketosis because I had restricted my carb intake, to that level. I
Yeah.
didn't find it difficult. I actually felt like it worked pretty well for me.
Mm.
It did become a little bit limiting in the variety of foods that were available, and I also felt that I probably wasn't getting enough vegetables and really any fruits on a
Mhm.
ketogenic diet.
Uh-huh.
So I relaxed that probably 2 years ago now.
Mm.
And but I did it did I found it very useful because it helped train me to recognize the types of foods that that had sort of hidden simple carbs. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people don't really know all of the foods that have added sugars or simple carbohydrates, just even without added sugar. So it kind of helped me in that way to train myself to recognize those foods, to recognize that for me at least, and again, I am very much a believer that there isn't a one size fits all
Sure.
optimal dietary strategy. I don't think ketogenic diet is right for some people, maybe many people, maybe most people. But
Mm.
for me at least, I didn't find it to be restrictive, and I felt pretty good when I was on a ketogenic diet. And like I said, I have maintained some of that. No longer, trying to really restrict carbs, but I got into the habit of avoiding foods in general that have a lot of simple carbohydrates. And so I eat now, I guess, what would be characterized as a low carb diet, at least compared to the average American.
Yeah. So you said you felt pretty good. So the BDNF, do you think there's something there in terms of the ketone bodies and some people, have this high from that
Yeah, I
from
wouldn't say that I got high on the ketogenic diet.
is it it's legal in
So what
Washington?
yeah, here's what I would say. So certainly I experienced, I would say, a mild version of the keto flu when I first started it,
Yeah.
which is pretty common. Some people have more severe reactions where you just really feel like crap for the first
Mhm.
week. I had sort of a mild form of that. But then I think once my body became keto adapted,
Mhm.
and what I mean by feel good is I wasn't hungry.
Mhm.
I didn't have any problems with appetite control. I did lose some weight, not a lot, but I did lose some weight, and I felt like I had a fair amount of energy. Like I felt pretty good, especially compared to what I had been before, which was eating a diet that had more simple sugars and things like that. So whether it was the ketone bodies and chemical changes because of the metabolic state that contributed to that sort of feeling of well-being, or whether it was just that I was healthier, that's a little bit harder for me to really parse out.
Mhm.
Again, I would say I haven't felt any worse since stopping doing a ketogenic diet. And if
Mhm.
anything, I would say my energy levels are, if anything, better since stopping the ketogenic diet. But I also did a little bit more of a dedicated resistance training regimen once I stopped a ketogenic diet as well. And
Mm.
I will say, I think in terms of um, that resistance training and positive changes in body composition. So again, a shift towards lean mass, a decrease in fat mass. I think coming off a ketogenic diet was beneficial for that. I
Mm.
think most people need to, you need some level of carbohydrates to really build muscle from resistance training, or to maybe optimally build muscle, I should say.
Mm.
So I think for me, again, I'm in a better overall state now than I was when I was doing a ketogenic diet, but overall I felt good when I was doing it.
Yeah. So I think the kind of take home message, if I understand you correctly, is um, it's very individualized. So for those who are, maybe obese, then it makes some sense to do intermittent fasting and fasting, and for those who are, more within the I guess the healthy range, then maybe not as useful as a lever to pull versus other things like strength training and cardio.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Although, again, I would say even within those buckets, it's
Mhm.
not necessarily going to be a one size fits all. So I
Sure.
think, for people who need to lose weight, for some people who need to lose weight, intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding can be very useful strategies. For
Yeah.
other people, it just doesn't work. Either they feel terrible, or
Yeah.
psychologically,
Mhm.
they feel like they are restricting themselves. And so it's counterproductive. So I think it's more about figuring out as an individual, what works for you.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing I would say, though, is I think, again, even for people who are normal weight, those strategies can be useful. You just have to figure out what's working for you to help you stay where you're
Mhm.
at, if you're already
Right.
there, or to get where you want to be, or need to be. I don't, and I don't know, again, even for people who need to lose weight, this is something where I think, the research needs to play out a little bit more. Is it from a body composition perspective, is fasting better or worse or no different in terms of, loss of lean mass compared to, maybe a daily restriction of 300 calories, right? So sort of slower weight loss,
Mhm.
where you just, you still eat every day, but you're not necessarily eating as much as you would to maintain weight. That needs to, we need a better understanding of that. I think it's also worth, and I don't think people really appreciate this yet, but I've heard Peter Attia talk about this on his podcast. And I think people should be paying attention. Some of these new drugs that have come online, like the GLP-1 agonists, very effective at helping people lose weight. But again, I think we're learning that many of those people who lose weight have negative changes in body composition. So
Right.
I would say, at a minimum, if you're gonna lose weight, regardless of whether it's through fasting or through medications or both, resistance training, you really should be prioritizing resistance training to try to maintain as much of your lean mass as possible during that weight loss process. It's probably even more important for people who are losing weight to
Mhm.
do dedicated resistance training than it is for people who are maintaining a healthy body weight.
Mhm. And all this changes as we get older as well, right? So, like for my mom, she's 88, and it doesn't make sense for her to
Right.
go on a diet. And
If anything, it might be the opposite, right? I mean, I think there have been
right.
a couple of studies that have come out recently suggesting that in people even over 65, so not necessarily in their 80s, that, you may not actually want to lose body weight once you get 65, 70s, 80s. And in
Mhm.
fact, it might be better to kind of, even if you're overweight, to stay where you're at. I don't think anybody's suggesting that we should go out and try to make older adults obese,
Yeah.
but it may not be a good idea to try to lose weight.
There's some data on the protective properties of like adiponectin. Uh, do you know about this? And what are your thoughts on this as we get
Yeah,
older?
certainly it's not my area of
Yeah.
expertise, although I think what I would say is while that may be true, I don't think we have really good ideas with a lot of strength behind them for what the mechanisms are. Most of these relationships come from, correlative
Right.
epidemiological studies. We don't even necessarily know causality. And, you can always point to, well, maybe it's because people who are losing weight when they're older are losing weight because they're sick, right? So it's not really that the weight loss
Mm,
is what's associating with poor health outcomes or mortality. It's a reverse causation. So
sure.
what I would say is that it may have something to do with protective effects of adiponectin or other hormonal effects of gaining weight or
Mhm.
a high calorie diet. But it really, I think it's too early, or it's unclear what the causality is. What I would say is, I think the current data as a whole are consistent with the idea that for older adults, and again, by older adults, I don't think we know exactly what that means, but let's just say 70 and above, it probably doesn't make sense to try to get them to lose weight, even if they're obese. Maybe if they're, morbidly obese and the obesity itself is causing
Mhm.
problems, and that could be joints
Right.
or organ failure. But in the absence of that, it probably doesn't make sense to try to get older adults to lose weight.
Mm,
Um, Probably maintaining weight should be the goal. I
yeah.
think that's would be my interpretation.
So you know, we talk about what's practical and what's not a lot, and what's pragmatic. And I think for my mom, what I've been emphasizing with her is uh, daily walks,
Yeah,
and supplementing with protein powder. She doesn't eat much. I think a lot of people, as they get older, they don't tend to eat many
yeah,
meals, and not much during those meals. So
right.
yeah, so beyond those two, not really focusing on weight loss, but aerobic fitness, and then going to the gym a couple times a week and doing some light resistance. Yeah, would you add, she sleeps well. Would you add anything to this population similar to her?
Um,
Oh, rapamycin also.
yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I certainly, again, not an MD, I'm not going to recommend rapamycin for people, but I think for
Yeah.
some people it can probably help. So I think what I would say is, again, it's very easy to want to make one size fits all sorts of recommendations. I think what you said makes a ton of sense for most people. Um, I would say, again, depending on the person, uh, for most people, it's never too late to try to add in some dedicated resistance training. So you said go to the gym once or twice a week. I don't know, there's lots of things you could do at a gym. I don't know if that means dedicated resistance training. I think by and large, again, the older we get, the more and more important it becomes to maintain lean mass and bone mineral density. And resistance training, is beneficial for both of those things. I think also, if your mom's anything like me, when I do resistance training, that cranks up my appetite. So it might also help with this idea of, helping to build an appetite in older adults. It's absolutely common that, as people get in their 70s and 80s, they see a decline in appetite. And again, I don't think we really know the mechanisms there. Is it hormonal? Is it because they're not as active? I don't think we really know.
Mhm.
But again, my intuition is that if you can get older adults to start doing some sort of resistance training, dedicated resistance training, that could help both with the lean mass and bone mineral density side of the equation, and also with the appetite. You mentioned supplementing protein. That makes a ton of sense. Again, I think the epidemiology is pretty clear that in people certainly over about age 65, maybe even younger, higher protein diet seems to be associated with reduced all-cause mortality. So, there's reason to think, aside from the expectation that a higher protein diet will preserve muscle mass, there may be other things that protein consumption is doing in older adults as well that is beneficial.
What's your timing then for your cardio and your strength resistance training? So, for me,
Mhm.
I wake up and I do my cardio or my strength training, and then I eat afterwards. What's the data, and what do you personally do?
Yeah. So again, I'm not really convinced that there is a right answer here. Like
Mm.
I don't think the data. So I think what the data suggests is that whenever you can do it, do it.
Sure.
Do your exercise. Makes sense. I don't know that there's convincing data that, morning is better than afternoon for resistance training. Some people will say don't exercise right before bed. Some people will say it's better to exercise right before bed. I think it depends on whether or not exercising right before bed impairs your ability to get good quality sleep. So
Mm.
again, this is where I think it's going to be somewhat individual. So I'll tell you what I do. First of all, what I do is whenever I can fit it in. So my schedule isn't the same necessarily from day to day. So most important, do it
Yeah.
whenever you can do it.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, but for me, typically, and also I think you asked about eating before, after. Again, I think it's very individual. So
Mm.
I personally find that I don't have any trouble working out right after I eat.
Mm.
I don't. I'm not going to eat a huge meal, right? But
Yeah.
if I eat breakfast, eat something for breakfast, I can go work out. It doesn't affect me. But I know other people who, you know, they don't feel like they can go do exercise for an hour and a half after they eat. So I think it depends a little bit on your own personal digestive system and psychology and all of that. So what I do typically, my preference is to get up. I'll usually, go through emails for 45 minutes, an hour in the morning, drink some coffee. Then I'll be hungry. I'll have something to eat. And then I'll go work out. Usually I do, I usually most days I'll do my cardio and resistance training in one workout. So I don't split them up, mostly because that's what my schedule allows for. So, I'll do like half an hour of cardio, and then I'll go to my resistance training for however long it takes, 45 minutes, an hour, depending on the day. And I'll usually try to do some cardio most days of the week. Let's just say 5 days a week, sometimes
Mhm.
six.
Mhm.
Sometimes that'll be going outside, going for a hike. Sometimes it'll be my wife and I there's a set of 110 stairs near our house. So we'll do up and down that for 20 minutes,
Wow.
whatever. And then other days will just be an elliptical in my garage, and then I'll lift weights. But I try to get out and do something most days of the week, and then I'll do resistance training 3-4 times a week. So, but I'm not super, like most things in my life. I'm not super rigid or rigorous about exactly what I'm going to do. Kind of
Mhm.
play it day by day. If I'm not feeling up to it one day, I don't like beat myself up because I didn't work out.
Mhm.
I try not to ever go 2 days in a row, but sometimes I do if I'm traveling.
Yeah.
But otherwise I just kind of do whatever I feel up for.
Yeah.
And it seems to work pretty well for me. So again, I think this is where you have to be very individual. Some people
Yeah.
find that if they have a journal and a very prescribed routine, and they're going to do, 3 sets of bench press and 3 sets of shoulder press, and it's all written out, and that works well for them, that's great. So I think you just have to kind of figure out what you can do. Again, I think the most important thing is whatever you're going to do, this is true both for nutrition and exercise. Whatever you're going to do, find something that you can sustain, right? I think
Yeah.
the real problem people have is they can start and then it just becomes something that is not sustainable, and then they stop, and then they feel guilty because they stopped, and it's this kind of vicious
Yeah.
cycle. So find something that you can be consistent with and stick with.
Yeah. I feel that for me personally that I like to just get it over with, my cardio especially. So I know that if that's the first thing I do, then I've already had a good day, and
Yeah.
whatever happens the rest of the day, then it's kind of a plus in terms of additional exercise. So, and also there's a kind of a habituation time period for all these habits, I guess. Um, what's your sense of how long it takes to habituate these good habits? Do you have any kind of feel for that from your
Boy,
personal
that's a
experience?
good question. So first of all, I will say I think what you said is spot on. So much of
Yeah.
this is really about habits.
Yeah.
And certainly, the more you do it, the more that it becomes part of your psychology. I think a
Yeah.
lot of it is, if you think of yourself as the kind of person who exercises, that's reinforcing, right?
Right.
So
Right.
so I absolutely think it's so much of this is about habits and building. Actually thought about it. I'm sure there's data on this, but I don't know the data on,
Yeah.
how long does it take for most people before it
Hmm.
really sinks in.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's
Yeah,
probably going to be individual, but I'm guessing
yeah,
it's, a few months.
yeah. That's
And,
I feel.
yeah. And I think certainly, one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with, and I think I've, historically in my life also struggled a little bit with this is, you always want instant gratification, right?
Yeah,
So if we're talking about lifting weights, you've been working out for a week, you want to be able to, see your muscles, right?
yeah,
That's not how it works, right? For
yeah,
weight loss or muscle gain, right? It takes a while. And so the longer that you stick with it, if you can psychologically recognize from the outset that this is a lifelong journey, right? Then you can stick with it the 6 months, 8 months, 12 months it takes to really start to see the changes that you want to see, right? But I think you have to go in, and I don't remember where I heard this, but I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, but I listen to a few select podcasts, and then on one of them, one of the guests said something that stuck with me, which is that you can really kind of change the equation here if you can convince yourself that the journey is the reward, right? So we're so used to thinking about, this number on the scale is the reward, right? Or when I can bench press this much weight, that's the
yeah,
reward. You can turn it around and say, no, 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 it's hard work, but it's that hard work and the fact that I went and did it, that's the reward. If you can convince yourself that the journey is the reward,
yeah.
then that sort of is a self-reinforcing way to kind of stay on that trajectory.
There's a saying also that good behavior is bad at first and good later. So you feel bad at first, and bad behavior is good
Yeah.
at first and bad later. So I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
truth to that. And
Well,
I
I would agree with that. But again, I think the psychological trick here is to
yeah,
convince yourself that the discomfort, I was going to say pain, but pain has all sorts of, that's a negative word.
yeah,
The discomfort that goes along with working hard, if you
mhm,
can recognize that actually, if you can appreciate that discomfort and
yeah,
recognize that that's a good thing,
yeah,
it changes the dynamic. And I think there's evidence that brain chemistry goes along with this.
mhm,
You can convince yourself of that. There's a dopamine release that you can drive to be associated with the effort that you're putting out to do
yeah,
something. And so I really do think there is a psychological component to behavior here that is super important. And people who are particularly successful at, doing, probably people who are successful at doing anything hard repeatedly and doing it well are able to often make that mental shift to recognizing that the hard work is actually a reward in and of itself.
yeah. I played college level tennis, and I'm still very much enthusiast, and it's really I think of tennis the same way. It's really I'll never play as well as I did back then, because I'm not as physically fit and all these kind of things. But to kind of continuously learn how to play tennis with the changes, in my
Yeah.
body and my mind, I
Yeah.
think that is very rewarding, and continues to be very challenging to you know be a good tennis player while adapting to the physical and mental changes that have occurred.
Right.
And you really have to continually relearn the game with these changes. So
Yeah. And avoid injury, right? That's the other
exactly.
thing that gets harder as you get older. Yeah.
Yeah, avoiding injury is a huge thing. I think we've discussed this before, where, when I was trying to do more strength training, and a couple times I hurt my shoulder and my elbow where, I'm doing free weights and, trying to
Yeah.
push heavy weights. And it's really after I finish my set, I'm trying to set the weight down. I've tweaked my elbow and tweaked my shoulder because, I'm not working with a trainer or anything. So,
Right.
because of that, I've gone to lighter weights and kind of more reps. So I think all these
Yeah.
things are learning experiences that we unfortunately get the hard lesson.
And I think I'm assuming this is more true for men than women, but maybe I should say this, but I think, certainly for men, that can be a challenge. You have to kind of
Yeah,
set your ego aside,
yeah,
when you're
yeah,
when you're it's certainly lifting weights, especially free weights, right?
yeah,
You get older, you have to kind of, okay, I don't have to go to my 1 rep max anymore.
Yeah,
And, yeah, I
yeah,
agree.
yeah. So if we can back up a bit, how would you define aging and health
Yeah,
span?
so it's a good question. It's a tough question to answer in a
Yeah,
concise way. So I think what I will say is, first of all, definitions matter. And so
yeah,
I'm glad you asked the question, because I think this is where oftentimes disagreements or confusion can arise, because people will talk about aging, but we mean very different things.
right.
So usually when I think about aging, and this is because of my history as a scientist in this field, I immediately think of biological aging. And that's the first sort of big differentiator, right? A
Mhm.
lot of people, when we think about aging, think about older people, older humans. A lot of people think about chronological time. I'm thinking about the biological mechanisms that underlie the changes in a person or an animal
Mhm.
going from a young person or animal to an old person or animal. So the mechanisms that drive that, the changes in tissue, cell, organ function that go along with aging. And I think that's a useful way to view aging, because when you do that, you immediately appreciate that indeed there is a biology here, right? Different animals age at different rates, and it's controlled by genetics. It's also affected by our environment, but there is a biology that underlies aging. And because it's a biological process, number one, that means we can study it. Scientists can study it, learn about it, start to understand it, and potentially do something about it. We can modulate all sorts of different biological processes with drugs, with nutrition, with other lifestyle, environmental modifications. We can potentially do something about the biology of aging to slow it down and keep animals and people healthier longer. The other thing to appreciate about biological aging is it is the greatest risk factor for nearly every major cause of death and disability and functional decline in humans. If you think about all of the major killers, most of the major killers, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, kidney disease, liver disease, COVID-19, influenza, all of them have biological age as their greatest risk factor. So if we can do something about that biology, we have the potential to actually delay the onset and progression, reduce the severity of all of these functional declines and diseases. So I think that's one of the reasons why studying the biology of aging has a potentially very important impact on human health. But go back to answering your question. That's what I think of when I think about aging, the molecular causes of the biology of aging.
Mhm. I think what you said there is so important, but it's a little difficult, I think, for a lot of people to understand. Um, uh, this idea that the biological mechanisms uh, have such a profound influence on your risk for all these
Yeah.
major diseases. And can you talk a little bit about why that is from a resilience standpoint and you know yeah, from resilience standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it. So again, I think, it's very clear that so resilience basically is a term that is able to describe our ability, whether it's at the whole person level or tissue level, organ level, to bounce back from some sort of damage or some sort of challenge, right? And so, um, I think COVID-19 is a great example here, right? Where COVID-19 is an infectious agent, right, that can get into our bodies and challenge our immune system. And we saw this with the pandemic, right? People who are relatively young tended not to get particularly sick and tended not to go to the hospital and not to die. Whereas people who were older, they got the same infections, but they were unable to bounce back from that infection. And in fact, what we saw was the opposite. They rapidly went the other direction, and this generalization, but by and large, we're at a much greater risk of severe outcomes and death. You can think about that in the context of all sorts of different organs and tissues and diseases. The exact mechanisms there are obviously complicated, and it's going to depend a little bit on the disease, right? So cancers are sort of interesting, where that's maybe a good case example where we can actually point to two different things that are happening during aging that dramatically increase your risk of developing most types of cancer. One is just DNA damage. So our genomes are always being subjected to all sorts of challenges, whether it's UV radiation from the sun or pollution that you're breathing in. All sorts of things are causing challenges to our genome in the form of DNA mutations. We know that DNA mutations, if they happen in the wrong gene, can cause cancer. That's well established. That's one way. So over time, those challenges are just continuing to increase and you're being exposed to those challenges more. What's less appreciated is most of the cancers that happen in our body actually get cleared right away by our immune system. So our immune systems, we think of them as really good at fighting off things like COVID-19 or bacterial infections. A lot of people don't think about our immune systems in the context of cancer. Most cancers will be caught very early, but as we get older, our ability of our immune system to hunt out those cancers and clear them is also declining.
Yeah.
And so you've got this double whammy to the cancer maintenance mechanisms, right? You've got more and more mutations happening and a decrease in the ability of our immune system to clear those cancers. And so what we see is it's not a linear increase in cancer with age. It's what we think of as an exponential increase, meaning think about like the shape of a hockey stick, right? It's kind of flat for a while, going up a little bit, and then all of a sudden it gets steeper and steeper and steeper and it's shooting straight up. So that's what we see for cancer. The interesting thing is we see exactly those same kinetics for heart disease, kidney disease, liver disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease. All of them show that exponential increase with age. I think another way to say this is just to give some numbers to it. So you think about things like obesity, high blood pressure, smoking, they increase your risk of heart disease or cancer by anywhere from 2 to 4-fold. Okay. Those are the things your doctor will tell you. If you go to the doctor and you're smoking, they'll say, stop smoking. And I agree with that. Stop smoking. It's a bad idea. The increase in risk of developing cancer going from age 45 to 85 is about 40-fold, 30 to 40-fold. So 2 to 4-fold obesity, high blood pressure, smoking, 40-fold. Aging 40 years.
Yeah.
Your increased risk of developing heart disease, 40-fold.
Yeah.
Increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, 300-fold. So again, it's orders of magnitude different between the biology of aging and these other risk factors. And again, I don't want to minimize the importance of these other risk factors. Absolutely, they're important. But I do want to illustrate if we could change that trajectory, you think about this thing, if we could change that slope, right, the impact on people's health and well-being and certainly longevity as well is probably much greater than the impact that we can have right now through things like optimal nutrition, exercise. So that's the promise, I think, of the science in this space. But again, I think we want to be realistic. We're not there yet. The last thing I'll add, because I also think this is really important, is the lifestyle interventions that we know about, diet and exercise, those are absolutely modifying the biology of aging. So it's not as if those lifestyle interventions are acting, independently of the biology of aging. No, they're actually the reason probably that they are beneficial for a bunch of different diseases is because they are modulating the biology of aging in a positive way and putting you on a better health span trajectory. But I believe that as we gain more and more scientific understanding of that biology of aging, we'll be able to do even better than we currently can with things like optimal nutrition and exercise and optimal sleep.
So during your trip over to Asia, to Philippines, and gave a talk in Manila, you started with saying that with what we know currently, we could extend healthy lifespan by 7 to 20 years or 7 to 15 years. I can't remember exactly. Yeah. So what combination of kind of health lifestyle changes and versus pharmaceutical interventions, what were you talking about specifically when you're talking about extending life?
Yeah. So one thing to appreciate is, so first of all, I think what you said is pretty accurate. My intuition is that if we could get most people to adopt something close to an optimal nutritional strategy and exercise regularly, the average person would probably gain between 7 and 15 years of healthy life expectancy. Okay. But it's important to appreciate that's an average, right?
Yeah.
So, that's not going to be the same for everybody. There is a component of luck, what I would say stochasticity, randomness to any individual's life expectancy. You can do everything right and still get cancer and die, right? That we all recognize this. You can do everything wrong and maybe you'll live to be 100 years old, right? So there's a lot we don't understand and there is some luck involved.
Sure.
But I think if we could get everybody to do that, yes, we could. What another way that I refer to this is we can recover the lost decade. So instead of saying if everybody ate well and exercised, you could get another 10 years. Another way to say that is most people are giving up a decade of quality life because they're choosing not to do these things, right? I think we could recover that lost decade. So what we have to recognize different people are
your screen is
don't necessarily know.
Sorry, can you repeat the
Am I back now?
last 30 seconds? It froze. Yeah.
Sure. Am I back now? Is it going okay? Okay. So I think we have to recognize that optimal is going to mean different things for different people, right? So there's not one size fits all. And we aren't quite there yet where we can tell for you personally, what is the optimal nutritional strategy? Or for me personally, it might be something different. That's where biomarkers come in. We need better biomarkers to really be able to optimize. But I think we can say in general, avoid simple sugars as much as possible, avoid highly processed foods, right? Eat lots of vegetables. Those are things that they're pretty rock solid, take it to the bank. Those are going to be beneficial. I think the things that are less clear is how much protein is optimal. Does it matter if you eat meat or don't eat meat? Those are all things that I think the science is unclear on. And, people have very strong opinions about these things. They're just opinions. It's not clear. So I think, but I think, the generalizations that I already mentioned and maintaining a healthy body weight. So what is a healthy body weight? Again, I think we just need to be pragmatic. So I think BMI over 25 is defined as overweight. BMI between, probably 20 and 25, 21 and 25. BMI is not great, but it's a useful metric, right? That's a good thing to go to a good thing to shoot for. Body composition, body fat, somewhere between 15 and 20% is probably about right. Maybe a little bit lower is better, but again, we don't know. I think 15 to 20% actually is achievable for most people if they really, really wanted to work for it. So I would say those are things that if people did that, if you ate a pretty good diet and you had a body fat between 15 and 20% and you exercised regularly, you got a pretty good shot at getting your lost decade back. So I think that's a pretty pragmatic, reasonable thing to say. And then obviously we can do better if you had sort of high resolution diagnostics on a person as an individual. So comprehensive blood chemistry, annual DEXA scan, right? Some preventative stuff to make sure that you don't have early developing cancers, things like that. Then I think you can go beyond that, beyond the generalizations and start to personalize things a little bit more. You probably want to have a pretty good way to assess chronic inflammation. We haven't talked about inflammation yet, but one of the things we know is that as a consequence of the biology of aging, there's a pretty dramatic increase in what we call sterile inflammation, which is really just age-related autoimmunity. And it's that sterile inflammation that leads to many of the functional declines that go along with aging, even just a lot of the aches and pains that go along with aging. So if we could measure that in individuals, we could tailor some strategies to try to deal with an individual's sort of inflammatory state. And that would be different for different people. So that's where we can start to get to the next level to kind of individually optimize some of these things.
So that's part of what hope to achieve with the OptiSpan and what you and I are trying to do in Asia. So can you talk about OptiSpan a bit and your role there and how that's going?
Sure. I'm going to keep it fairly general because I
Sure.
think we're still in the stage where, we're both we're planning some of this out and we don't want to give too much away. But I think in a general sense, we recognize, first of all, that um, in most parts of the world, what we call healthcare really isn't healthcare, it's disease care. And what I mean by that is we are very good at waiting until people are sick and then trying to do something about their disease. And I think the sort of modern medicine has been quite effective at keeping sick people alive. And in the United States today, the estimates are that about 90% of healthcare spending goes to treat chronic diseases. And those are mostly diseases of aging,
Mm,
cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, we can go down the list, right? So these are treating people who have one or more age-related diseases
mhm.
and keeping them alive in a state that is, better than dead for sure. Like I'm not trying to minimize the benefits of keeping people alive, but wouldn't it be better to keep people alive without any age-related
Yeah.
diseases, right? So that's what I would say healthcare really should be aimed towards, but it's not currently. There are a variety of reasons for that beyond the scope of this conversation, I think. So our goal at Optispan is to really start to help with the transition that I think is coming, which is a transition towards preventative, science-based longevity medicine. And by longevity medicine, what I really mean is medicine that targets the biology of aging to push back these chronic declines and diseases of aging. And so in order to help, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. They're not even sure the science is completely there to happen now. But as we've already discussed, there are some things that we can do to
Yeah.
keep people healthy, right? Independent of sort of, next generation longevity interventions. So in order for that transition to happen, though, there are a variety of things that need to occur. One of which is helping practitioners, and by that I mean mostly physicians, first of all, recognize that this is possible today. There are things we can do. And then to give them the tools to enable them to be able to do it. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to create a friction-free toolkit that will enable practitioners who want to practice science-based preventative and longevity medicine to help usher in 21st century medicine, or as Peter Attia says, medicine 3.0, right? And so we want to be enablers of that. And so we're trying to help create that toolkit. So what does that toolkit look like? Well, it's going to include diagnostics. So what are the right diagnostics to do this? Some of those will be making sure people don't have a pre-existing condition that's going to prevent them from recapturing their lost decade. Some of them are going to be diagnostics to actually measure the aspects of the biology of aging. So what are the right menu of options? How do we get providers access to those diagnostics? How do we integrate that data? And how do we take that integration of data? What's the algorithm to then be able to give providers the tools that they need to interpret that data, act on it, and communicate it to their patients? So in a general sense, that's the problem that we're trying to solve from start to finish, or at least start to solve. Again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be iterative. There's going to be learning that goes along with it. But that's really the overarching mission, is to disrupt the disease care industry and usher in what we think should be the future of healthcare.
Um, so at the Aging Research and Drug Development Conference last year in Denmark that we were at, there was a huge fund that was launched, the Saudi $1 billion a year fund for directed towards this space, and of course Google's involved in huge investments, and so there's huge money pouring into this space, and for a bunch of different aspects of this space. So how would you differentiate what you are trying to do in this space with what everyone else is trying to do, and how do you think you can make this stand out from the crowd, so to speak, with all that money coming in?
Sure. So I think there's a few things to say. One is I don't think we necessarily. So first of all, there are other smart people with aligned visions to what I
Sure.
described. I think, maybe not taking exactly the same approach, but aligned vision and goals. And I think that's great. So first of all, I think that there is going to be so much disruption and so much demand for this type of healthcare
Hmm.
that there's plenty of room
Right.
for multiple groups to have an impact. And I also think there's not necessarily one path to doing this. So I'm not so worried about that side of it. I also think that a lot of the large investments that are coming into the field are complementary, not competitive. And what I mean by that is most of the large influx of resources. So you mentioned Hevolution, which is the Saudi foundation, and Calico, which is the Google company, and Altos, which is Jeff Bezos and some other investors. Most of those are focused on advancing the understanding of the biology of aging from very basic research through to bringing some of these discoveries into clinical practice.
Mhm.
Those are all things that will catalyze what we're trying to accomplish at Optispan, because as those discoveries from the basic science make their way through validation and hopefully FDA approval to become clinical practice, those are things that we can incorporate into our toolkit. So
Mhm.
I actually view it as quite complementary and quite a good positive sign that there is so much investment in basic geroscience all the way through to biomedical biotechnology companies taking discoveries through the clinical path to FDA approval. So I think that's all very positive and will only help hopefully accelerate this transition to 21st century medicine that I alluded to.
Mhm. From a major kind of inflection points in this space. So I think the discovery of rapamycin, which Peter Attia referenced you in his book for your work in that space. So major lifestyle changes, rapamycin. How do you see these kind of major inflection points in increasing healthy longevity? How do you think the rate of that will change over the next 10, 15 years? And where do you think that's going to come from?
Yeah, it's good question. I honestly don't know. So here's what I would say. I think I'm very confident that we will have better tools to measure biological aging in the next 5 to 10 years. There has been a lot of work, a lot of progress in the biomarker space. We're starting to get a better understanding of what some of these different ways of measuring parts of biological aging, what they're telling us, how they work. What we don't know yet is how useful these different tools are at validating interventions. So
Mhm.
that's going to be something that I think will have a big impact in two ways. One is in helping move interventions through the preclinical and early clinical stage to figure out which interventions really look like they're worth investing in for clinical trials, which obviously are very expensive. So I think the diagnostics and the biomarkers will help there. The other place where I think they'll help is in personalizing strategies for optimizing longevity. So while it may not mean that we are able to add 40 years to a person's life, what it might mean is we can do a much better job at telling you what you need to do to get your lost decade and maybe another decade, right? So I think that's where those sorts of tools will come in. Predicting whether or not we're going to have kind of what I would call game-changing or next-generation interventions that could have,
Mhm.
larger effects on health span and lifespan than what we know about today. That's a much harder thing to really to really do with much confidence, at least for me. And part of the reason why it's difficult for me to have a ton of confidence there is I sort of feel like in some ways, despite the fact that there's been more and more research or more and more funding and resources going into the field, in some ways, discovery of new interventions has slowed way down in the last 10 years.
Mhm.
And one thing I would point to just as evidence for that is, rapamycin was first shown to increase lifespan in yeast in 2006 and in mice in 2009. We haven't had anything better since then, right? There's been a lot of things tried. Nobody's done better than rapamycin. Why is that? I think that's, again, probably a different discussion, but I would suggest that one of the reasons why nobody's done better than rapamycin is because there's not a lot of innovation in what people are trying. Most people are focusing on targeting the hallmarks of aging. Nobody's really looking outside of that. So the one place where I would say that could be wrong. So everything I said could be wrong. We could get a big game-changing effect is from partial epigenetic reprogramming. That remains to be determined.
Mhm.
But if we don't get a big effect from partial epigenetic reprogramming, let's just say it turns out to be roughly equivalent to rapamycin, then I don't really see anything on the horizon right now that
Mhm.
looks like it's going to do a lot better.
Mhm.
So I'm maybe less optimistic than a lot of people are that we're going to be looking at, 30, 40, 50, 60-year increases in life expectancy. A lot of people want to point to the dramatic increase in technology and artificial
Yeah.
intelligence, and chat GPT is going to solve aging for us. Maybe, I hope so, but I'm a little bit less optimistic about that. Having said that, I would certainly think that with the resources coming into the field from places like Evolution, there should be enough for some people to start to do more unbiased, highly innovative, high risk, high reward kinds of studies to hopefully get us to that next level of interventions that could really have a major impact on the biology of aging, and again, kind of change the game. But again, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, because let's just think about where we're at today, right? I mean,
Yeah.
most medicine that's being practiced today, we're using what I would say are 21st century tools to do 20th century medicine, right?
Yeah.
So let's just get to the point where we're using 21st century tools to do 21st century medicine, and then we can worry about the next generation. So that's kind of what I see as the next thing that we need to, from a clinical perspective, really need to focus on.
Yeah, so I think that's important from a personal level as well as, population level. And, to leverage what we already know on a population level would have a massive impact on society. But for, those of us who are, heavily into this space and have been for a number of years already, for me at my age, I feel like uh, using the levers that we have currently, and
Yeah,
I'm getting healthier
yeah,
as the years go by. I think I will be healthier next year at 63 than I am this year at 62, which is pretty amazing uh thing to think about, when most people it's totally the opposite, and the
yeah,
decline is very obvious.
yeah,
So if we go back to rapamycin, you came out, so to speak, at the Denmark meeting as saying that you take rapamycin, and of course I've been taking it for quite a while now, and do you know roughly how many? What would you guess the number of people who are taking rapamycin now? I remember Alan Green said he's at 1,000 or so
yeah.
patients. So what would you estimate globally, the number of people who are on this for longevity?
That's tough to do,
Sure.
in part because I feel like there has been a very dramatic increase in attention being paid to rapamycin, and people who are taking rapamycin what we would call off-label. And so what I
Right.
mean by that is, they get a prescription from their physician, or they get it through other means, which I don't recommend,
Yeah.
for a purpose other than what it's been approved for potential health span promoting purposes. Dramatic increase over the last year, I
Mhm.
would say. So total guess, but I'm guessing 50,000 people worldwide,
Yeah.
maybe more. Wouldn't
Mhm.
surprise me.
Yeah.
Also very interesting, the sort of circle of people where this has been, at least in my experience, most notable. We're talking about a lot of a lot of people like you have described yourself, who have sort of been in this space, very interested in either optimizing health or longevity for a while, but also a lot of people who are, a very successful high-end CEOs or venture capital people, right? I'm here. It's funny because I talk to lots of people, and somebody will just drop that they'll just tell me, oh yeah, I started taking rapamycin a few months ago, and I'm like, whoa, okay.
Yeah,
So I think it's hard to know, but I have
yeah,
the feeling that there's a lot of people out there now using rapamycin off label who weren't even 6 months ago.
yeah. Uh, so it was interesting in Denmark as well. I overheard some people who are leading researchers in rapamycin who don't take rapamycin and who have said, I would never take rapamycin.
Yeah,
So yeah, so it's quite interesting. What do you think are the it's legitimate concerns?
yeah,
The mechanisms of rapamycin are there's so many different effects on our body from uh, you know T and B cell proliferation, uh, and anti-tumor, immunosuppressive. So can you kind of summarize the all the different properties of rapamycin and where the concern is, and from taking it yourself, how do you kind of wrap your head around the use of rapamycin for
sure.
this space?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing I'll say is, and this is taking a step back, this isn't specific to rapamycin necessarily, but I think, first of all, most people don't take a very rational or thoughtful approach to risk reward when we're thinking about anything really. But, particularly prescription medications, there is all sorts of shit we put in our bodies that is terrible for us, way worse than rapamycin. And we don't even worry about it, right?
Nachos?
Nachos, right? Yeah, whiskey. So again, I don't think we take a very logical or rational approach to really thinking about risk reward,
Yeah.
specifically for rapamycin or for all sorts of other things that we do in our lives. So I think that's part of it. I don't know if this is true everywhere. It's maybe somewhat cultural in the United States, but certainly in the United States, the FDA is extremely risk averse, and that is translated through to the way the general population thinks about pharmaceutical medications. There's also some, somewhat valid suspicion of pharmaceutical companies and their competing interests, and historical examples like tobacco companies where the public has been lied to about the real dangers of some of these things. So I think there's a cultural and psychological perception that pharmaceutical medications are risky, right? That they're dangerous. And that definitely somewhat comes from FDA, who is very much all about minimizing risk and doesn't really think much about reward. So that weighs into that. So that's all just to say that I don't think that I think it's very difficult to have a rational or logical view of actual risk reward when you're thinking about something like rapamycin. So why are people concerned about rapamycin? I think in some sense, it's a unfortunate byproduct of how rapamycin was developed clinically. So rapamycin was first developed and approved as an organ transplant medication. It goes under the name sirolimus or rapamycin. So that's how it was clinically developed and first FDA approved. In that context, and these are high doses of rapamycin, in that context, there is a long list of side effects that goes along with taking rapamycin. In organ transplant patients taking daily high doses of rapamycin, those side effects include increased risk of infection. That's exactly what you would expect for a drug that prevents organ transplant rejection, right? By knocking down immune function. Increased risk of infection, high triglycerides, mouth sores is the most common side effect, not a huge, life-threatening risk, but uncomfortable. Potentially some effects on metabolism that look something like diabetes. Those are interesting to think about from a scientific perspective. And the list goes on and on. So then the question becomes, if we look at lower doses of rapamycin, what does the risk profile actually look like? And there's some published studies, a couple of clinical trials. some unpublished data that we've collected that hopefully will be out soon. I'm pretty convinced that the actual risks are relatively small, at least over, short-term periods. And by that, I mean 3 months, 6 months, a year. So we did a pretty comprehensive analysis of self-reported side effects from people taking rapamycin and compared it to age-matched people who'd never taken rapamycin. Only thing that was statistically more frequent in rapamycin users was mouth sores. No significant increased risk of infection. Several things that were significantly more frequent, several negative things that were significantly more frequent in non-users compared to rapamycin users. So overall, I think the risk is pretty small, but overcoming the reputation problem that rapamycin has is quite challenging, and it's not going to happen overnight. And I think it's important to say we really don't know what the long-term risks are. If you were to take rapamycin for the next 5 years, what would the long-term risk profile look like? I don't think we have no data, so I can't say with any certainty what that looks like. What I can say is if you take the whole population and you were to give them, ad libitum access to alcohol, a lot more people would have problems from alcohol than they're going to get from taking rapamycin for 5 years. So again, if we were to really think about a rational risk reward, alcohol is way more risky than rapamycin is. Plus, maybe rapamycin will give you an extra 10 years of healthy longevity. We don't know that either, but there's biological plausibility, at least, to that possibility.
Okay, so for those who have made the decision and are taking rapamycin, like you and I, what concerns would you have, and how do you take it? Time of day, with meal, without a meal, exercise, all these kind of things. What do you think about when you are taking it?
Yeah. So first of all, so again, collect the data we've collected from people. It's all over the map. People are doing all sorts of different stuff. Most common is 6 milligrams once a week, and the reasons for that are probably in part because there have been a few physicians, Alan Green most notably, who have prescribed rapamycin early and to many people, and that's sort of what they've recommended. Personally, what I've done is I've cycled it. So I, will take it usually 10 weeks at a time. I've done a few different things, 6 milligrams once a week, 10 milligrams once a week. Never really noticed any side effects. The reason I started taking rapamycin was because I was diagnosed with inflammation of the shoulder capsule. It's called adhesive capsulitis. It was very, very painful. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't throw a ball. The specialist who diagnosed it told me to go to physical therapy and it might go away in a year. And I was like, that's terrible. So that's actually why I started taking it. And it either placebo effect or rapamycin cured my frozen shoulder. I can't say which, but whatever it was, it worked. And the reason why I do it in like 10-week cycles is because we know from studies in animals that that's long enough to knock down the age-related inflammation. That's probably the main thing that rapamycin does. It does other stuff. It boosts autophagy. It modulates mitochondrial function. It affects protein synthesis. But my intuition is the biggest effect, at least for health span, is blunting that age-related inflammation. And so within about 6 to 10 weeks in mice, there's very potent effects on knocking down age-related inflammation. That was my experience with my shoulder. And the rationale for doing that cycling is if there are going to be side effects, it's probably less likely that you'll experience any real side effects, doing it periodically as opposed to doing it continuously. But that, again, it's all speculation. We just don't have the clinical trials or the data to really know for sure.
And how long do you stop for? You do 10 weeks?
Again, I mentioned before that I'm not very rigid in the way that I approach many things in life, and that includes my use of rapamycin. So it varies. And I kind of go by how I'm feeling, honestly. Actually, I haven't been taking rapamycin for about 7 months, and that is because I have been doing, as part of my new venture, a bunch of baseline diagnostics on myself, and I want to get the baseline diagnostics so I can do a self-experiment with rapamycin. So I'm waiting until I get all of those completed before I start my next cycle of rapamycin. But, previously it's been kind of guided by when I start to feel the aches and pains in my joints come back again, mostly when I'm doing resistance training. It's again, I can't prove it's rapamycin. It could be psychological, but it's been my perception that when I'm on rapamycin, those aches and pains go down,
Mhm.
and it takes, a few months for them to come back once I stop taking rapamycin.
And Alan Green kind of modulates the dose depending on how old you are and kind of your
Yeah.
existing condition. How do you feel about that?
So I see the rationale. I think the way I would answer that question is I would really like to have some diagnostics that can give us an idea. So very simplistically, it is my speculation that people who have a higher level of sterile inflammation are going to be the ones that are going to get the biggest benefit from rapamycin. We have some tools to measure that. I don't think we know exactly what the right inflammatory markers are, but we come up with some ideas. So I would love to know, number one, can we stratify people based on these inflammatory markers? The answer is yes. Number two, if we were to give people rapamycin, would we see a preferential decrease in inflammatory markers in people who have a high inflammatory burden? And would those people be the ones who experience or perceive benefits from rapamycin? That's my speculation. And from anecdotal conversations I've had with people, it seems to me that people who have a tendency towards autoimmune disorders are the ones who perceive benefits from rapamycin, whereas most people who I've talked to who've taken rapamycin say, I don't really feel anything. I can't tell. And I don't know if that's good or bad. That's the experience of most people.
Lastly, about stress. So do you feel like leaving, last time we met, it was the day after your last day at University of Washington. So how do you think this new life will affect your stress level compared to your old life? And how do you think about that stress?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's fair to say that I'm not a particularly stressed out person in general,
You don't
but
seem that.
yeah. But I will say, I'd say my happiness index has definitely gone up. And I'm not going to bash academia. I think their
Yeah.
academia is great for many things and does a lot of good things for the world. But personally, it was the right time for me to do something different. And I think that I expect that regardless of what the future holds, there will be no regrets. I'm not going to be looking back, and I expect that I will, be happier and more fulfilled in the future going forward. And certainly, I will say, my frustrations with some of the things about academia that had sort of grown are gone, and that's really good. I'm enjoying
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Then what do you hope to do with this new life in 5 years? 5 years from now, you've developed this toolkit for practitioners, and
Yeah.
and what do you think kind of midterm happiness for you in the space looks like?
So I think there'll be a couple things that will be very hopefully rewarding. So number one is I think the personal stories of changing people's health and helping them recover their lost decade will be extremely rewarding. So that I'm very much looking forward to. It's very different than anything I've ever done before in the sense that, when you're working on basic research, you certainly always hope that you will discover something that will have an impact down the road that will make the world a better place. I think that seeing the impact of what you're doing for individuals will be quite rewarding, and I've already experienced that. So that's great. I think bigger picture, if we are able to help change the perception in the medical community even a little bit about
Hmm.
shifting away from sick care towards, keeping people healthy, that will be really important. And I think, what I would envision as success now, and again, it's very hard to predict the future. My view of success 6 months from now might be very different. But if we have created tools that many physicians are utilizing or other companies are utilizing to help improve the health of millions of people, that would be a huge success. So that's what I hope we accomplish. And I think we've got, I think again, the healthcare, disease care world is going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. It has to. It's not sustainable. And
Yeah.
so I'm hopeful that we can help change it in a positive way, as opposed to, some of the doomsday scenarios that are out there as well. So I think we can have an impact there.
Yeah. I feel a big part of it is how, on a one-to-one level with the patients that come in, how do we get them to have this mental shift in both taking care of themselves and how they think medicine should be practiced, and kind of what their doctors who are practicing the more traditional 2.0 medicine, how to overcome all these things so that they can improve their life and gain all the benefits from the knowledge that has been generated over the last few decades. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, again, you have to be realistic, right? You're not gonna get everybody to participate. It's not going to be easy to change providers, physicians' viewpoints, right? But you have to start somewhere. And I think we can have an impact, and it's going to take time. But I think that's what needs to happen. And I'm optimistic that we, you, other people, all of us can help move the needle in the direction that it needs to go. And every person who you help get their lost decade back is a victory, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's one person or a million people.
Yeah.
So I think that's the way I think about it. The other thing I would just maybe leave with is, the impact here is potentially enormous, right? So let's just say if we accept that most people can get a decade, right? A decade of healthy quality life, a decade with their kids, grandkids, great grandkids, with their friends and loved ones, doing what they want to do. If we can help a lot of people get that decade back, right? You can help a million people. And I think that's down the road, that's possible, right? If we can actually get this somewhat mainstream, that's 10 million years of quality human life, right?
Wow. You put
Yeah.
it that way.
So we're
That's
talking about something important here.
definitely. Yeah, I mean, on a personal level, I had this epiphany when I was 55. I shared this with you, where I saw, my health profile going down, and knowing my family history, diabetes, heart issues, Alzheimer's, hypertension, and personal health, decreasing along with the health profile, the blood test. Then I knew I had to do something, and so to implement the things that we've been discussing over the last 7 years personally, and seeing the really the change in trajectory from downwards to
Yeah.
reversing that. I can't overstate how rewarding and really gratifying that is, and then to share that with my family and friends as well.
I think that's super important. And I think, we shouldn't minimize the impact that this can have sort of as a cascading effect. I think what you just talked about is something that I've seen in other people as well, and I've certainly experienced myself, is the impact that every person whose trajectory you change, they have the opportunity to go out and change the trajectory of their loved ones, right? And so I think that, there absolutely is the potential here to really have a very large impact beyond the individual patients that maybe are being seen at your clinic. Yeah.
Well, would you have any other final thoughts? Anything I didn't ask you that you think is relevant and important to share?
I think we pretty much covered the key points. Again, I think, really thinking hard about. So I think here's what I would say. Every individual who's listening, really think about where you're at in your own health span trajectory. Are you where you want to be, right? Are you taking steps to recover your lost decade, or if you've already gotten it back, to maintain it, right? So think hard about where you're at. Are you getting the quality of healthcare that you deserve, right? Your health, is your most important asset, Are you investing in it the way that you should? And if the answer is no, ask yourself why not, and then do something.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this session. So thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And
Sure.
I look forward to chatting again in the near future. Thanks for watching this interview with Professor Matt Kaeberlein, and see you next time on Aging, Radiation, and Tennis.